Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on basic sociology, in today's lecture we are going to understand the gender frame as analytical tool for understanding social inequality. And we are going to refer to the article by Cecilia Ridgway, that is Framed Before We Know, Gender Inequality in Modern Society. Now the argument is that a lot of economic social transformation has taken place, but despite the transformation we are aware that gender inequality persists, and this has become a puzzle among the feminists and a lot of scholars working on gender inequality. So in Framed by Gender, Cecilia Ridgway attempts to explain why, even in the face of cultural and institutional pressure that would seem to level distinction between men and women, gender inequality remains deeply rooted in everyday life. So she uses in the idea of symbolic interaction given by Goffman and Garfinkel and tries to understand the persistence of gender inequality by using the doing gender theory. And doing gender is how we kind of enact gender in terms of our everyday interaction. So she largely draws evidence from experimental social psychology and develops a theory of gender as an ever-present background identity on which actors readily draw in classifying each other and coordinating their activities. At heart, she argues, gender is a status distinction that advantages men over women. Because men have greater control over power and resources than women do, both men and women accept a gender hierarchy in which men are perceived as better than women. And how has this happened? This has happened through the process of social interaction, where people kind of categorize individual based on certain difference, and this difference then transforms into inequality based on stereotypes, and these stereotypes are reflected in our everyday behavior and gives us a different status. So different groups are kind of given a different status in the hierarchy, and based on the status the ranking into a dominant and subordinate group happens, and then whatever the dominant group idea is or the cultural knowledge is gets to be legitimized and universally accepted by all. Those who disagree with the gender hierarchy nevertheless believe that most people think this way. So if everybody is doing it and there is one exception, then people feel that the one who is not doing is out of the order, and what is happened by a large majority is how people do it, and that's kind of gets natural. She argues that gender is particularly relevant in mixed sex settings and in the performance of tasks that are strongly linked to the skills of one sex. And by this she is that when there was a kind of a traditional agrarian society where there was no gender segregation, so it was kind of a group where everybody was working together, then gender segregation started happening and people said these are the feminine work and these are masculine work. So as there was a kind of a subordinate relation, but things were going. Now what has happened is that there is an assumed idea that modern industrial society is an egalitarian society. So the group which is the occupational group or the place of work is a mixed group, so men are working as well as women are there. So there how does this gender relation kind of impacts the everyday relation is what the author is trying to investigate. And the idea is that in these mixed sex settings, gender is likely to be effectively salient. It influences our behavior in interaction in measurable ways. Our need to categorize others quickly in interaction means that the gender frame is likely to persist as a fundamental background identity, a culturally convenient coordinating device. So it's a group where there is a kind of people from different gender, from different background. Now how do you coordinate your relation? The most efficient manner to kind of categorize or assign status is gender. It is conveniently used to segregate individual And so we see that even if kind of say women join say the armed forces, even when if they she's a kind of a fighter pilot, but yet the gender works and she is kind of assigned a ground duty and she's not necessarily going to the forefront to fight, with the gender stereotype that women cannot see or are emotional and they will not be able to do that. So that is what is kind of triggering the gender inequality status. Gender status beliefs are resistant to change and will always lag behind changes in the economy or achievement by individual women that appear to challenge deeply held stereotypes. So the stereotypes are there, and therefore we get to kind of hear news that someone has kind of become has achieved this despite her being a woman. So that identities that doesn't get invisible, it's out there, and it kind of categorizes the achievement also that individual has achieved in the public sector. Now, Cecilia Ridgway uses two framework. She's saying that social relationship, two frameworks are used. At level 1 is primary person framework, that is who you are is your primary identity, whether you are a woman or a white man, on what age, whether you are young, adult or an old. So, the first framework is your primary person frame, and the second interaction happens at the second level is the institutional frame, and the institution could be a home, a family, university, place of work, a prison, any kind of an institution. Now, when we look into the primary person frame, people typically confront the problem of coordination between the two framework. The instructions for behavior encoded in gender stereotype are exceedingly abstract and diffuse. For this very reason, they can be applied to virtually any situation, but by the same token, they do not take an actor very far in figuring out what exactly how to behave in that particular institutional framework. In contrast, the institutional framework, even vague, ones such as the family are more specific. They contain defined roles and the expected relation among them. The roles that are embedded in the institutional and organizational framework are often themselves infused with gendered cultural meaning. The most powerful ways that the gender frame affects the gendered structure of society is through infusing gendered meaning into the institutional practices and procedures. So, you have been a kind of applying the legal norms of gender inequality and have taken both men and women into the work, but once the work actually takes place, the everyday interaction takes place, the gendered norms or the gender stereotypes are used in terms of allocating roles or in terms of kind of following the procedures and practices. The extent to which gender frame flavors or biases the performance of institutional role identity depends on two general factors. The first is the salience and the relevance of the gender frame in the situation. This depends on the gender composition of the institutional context and the extent to which the activities and roles in this context are themselves culturally gendered. When organizational activities are gendered, the background gender frame becomes more powerful. So, if it is say a non-governmental organization or a women group which the high majority are say from one particular gender, then the gender background will become more functional. But if it is a group which has kind of mixed composition, and there the gender framework kind of becomes irrelevant in terms of your organizational roles and responsibility. The gendering of institutional tasks or roles then empowers the background gender frame in a situation to become significant part of the process by which people enact the institutional role. The second factor for the functioning of gender frame is the extent to which organizational rules and procedures constrain individual discretion in judgment and behavior. So, if the rules of the organizations are completely legal, there is no scope of breaking the rule, then the gender framework will be minimum, or it will kind of be irrelevant in the workspace. The more constrained individual actions are, the less scope the gender frame has to implicitly shape the behavior on its own. Now, this gender framing perspective has been used by the author to understand the gender segregation in the modern workplace. And for this reason, many scholars have recommended formal rules and procedures as devised to suppress stereotype bias and discrimination in employment. So, you want a gender parity in wage, you have the minimum wage act, whereby irrespective of the gender of the individual, the wage will be paid as per the work done. So, in this situation, the individual choice is not there, and the organizational cannot use the gender framework for differentiating or discriminating between the two employees. So, the gender framing perspective suggests that whether formal personal procedures do more good than bad depends not only on the extent to which bias is built into the procedure, but also on how powerfully disadvantaging the gender frame would be for women if actors were not constrained by formal procedures. Thus, there is no simple answer to the questions, are formal rule best? So, the author is basically trying to understand that do you need a legal law, or do you need rules and procedures to restrain the use of gender, and it could be kind of both positive and negative. Sometimes the gender framework does not kind of discriminate, and the rules can be kind of more egalitarian. However, in many cases you can misuse the legal law and yet kind of discriminate it, and people depends on individual choice, that even without any kind of a legal binding, one can be gender neutral at the workplace. The background gender frame is the primary mechanism by which material organizational structure becomes organized by gender. By the same token, these organizational structures sustain widely shared cultural beliefs about gender. To the extent that economic, technological and political factor changes the structures and the material arrangement that they create between men and women, these material changes create gradual iterative pressure for change in cultural belief about gender as well. So, it is a two-way process. Once the organizational structure, legal norms, technological changes are bringing about change in gender relation, these are kind of triggering the cultural changes, and cultural change also kind of leads to progressive and more kind of technologically oriented society. Now, we are going to refer to the two example or the two illustration which Cecilia Ridgway uses to explain the persistence of gender inequality. The first is the gender in innovative high-tech firm, and this comes from the studies of the small science focused startup firms that have become a leading edge of biotechnology and information technology industry, what is referred to as the IT industry. Many of these high-tech firms have adopted a new organizational logic called the network firm. Work in these firms is organized in terms of project teams that are often jointly constructed with a network of other firms. Science in a firm move flexibly among these project teams, and the hierarchies of control over the activities are relatively flat. In this informal, flexible structure, advantages or disadvantages for women scientists who work in these high-tech firms. Research suggests that the answer is quite different for biotech firms based in the life sciences than it is for the firms based in engineering and the physical sciences. such as IT firms. That is comparing two workplaces. One is the IT, high-tech industries, and the other is the biotech firms. And the gender framework is used at a different level in both these, whereas both the organization have flexible structures. Now, are these flexible structures advantageous to women who have kind of taken up the role of a scientist? And to understand why the same organizational logic plays out so different for women scientists in one context compared to the other, it is important to take into account how the background frame of gender acts in each context. The life sciences are not strongly gender typed in contemporary culture. Not many kind of have taken up the life sciences, the numbers are still less. And due to the mixed gender composition of the workforce in this field, cultural belief about gender will be salient in biotech firms but only diffused. Because the field is not strongly gender typed, the background gender created only modest advantage for men in expected competence. Facing only modest biases, women scientists in biotech should have the basic credibility with their co-workers that they need to take effective advantage of the opportunity offered by the flexible structures of innovative firms. They should be able to press forward with their interest, work around bad actors if necessary, find projects that match their skills and excel. As a result, in the biotech context, an informal flexible organization form could be more advantageous for women than would a more hierarchical structure. Women life scientists do better in these innovative biotech firms than they do in more traditional hierarchical research organizations such as pharmaceutical firms. In comparison to more hierarchical firms, women in these flexible firms achieve more supervisory position and attain parity with men in the likelihood of having at least one patent to their name. Even in these innovative firms, however, the total number of patent women acquire is less than that comparable to men, as it is also in traditional hierarchical firms. So, the background gender bias still modestly favors men, even in this innovative biotech context. In contrast to the life sciences, engineering and the physical sciences are strongly gender typed in favor of men in our society. The background gender frame in the IT context is more powerfully relevant and creates stronger implicit bias against women competence than in the biotech settings. In this situation, the informality and the flexibility of the innovative firm is unlikely to be an advantage for women scientists and may even be a disadvantage. Facing strong challenge to their credibility, it will be harder for women to take effective advantage of the flexible structure. Also, in the context of a masculine type gender frame, the informal work structure may lead to a boys club atmosphere in these innovative IT firms. So, it is coming in from the stereotype, from the common knowledge that IT, engineering are masculine work, and therefore, women in these firms will have to find their way out through the masculine and the formation of boy club in the group. This example suggests that we cannot understand the full implication of a particular organizational logic for the gender structure it will produce without considering how the organizational logic interacts with the background effect of the gender frame. That is, we are carrying on with the gender frame of the into the different spheres. So, it is so she is taking two example of workplace from the affluent society in which women have made a mark. So, you have the biotech firm, so biology, are kind of again assigned to be more close to women, and therefore, the gender framework is less effective. However, in say the engineering and IT firm, it's kind of dominated by a masculine background. The gender background framework is very dominant, and therefore the women who have been a part of this organization have to in the everyday interaction face the discrimination or the inequality which is produced because of the gender framework. The second example that Cecilia uses is the sex segregation of field of study in affluent society, and this comes from the study of Maria Charles and Karen Bradley, and they have done a provocative study of how the sex typing of field of higher education varies across society. The sex segregation of field of study such as humanities or engineering feeds one of the most durable and consequence gender structure of industrial societies, an economic process that undermine gender inequality. There is no answer to this question from a purely economic and structural perspective. So, we kind of try to understand that we will not be able to get a very clear cut understanding of whether all affluent society where there has been a progress in the technology, in science, have been able to grapple with the situation of the gender inequality. Why? Because this gender inequality is acting as a background identity, and this identity is kind of culturally specific. So, in one affluent society, we could kind of consider the categorization of hierarchy of education, which we are all familiar with. So, we know that even despite kind of bringing in interdisciplinarity or bringing in so much of change in the educational policy, we still have a high stereotype that girls are kind of more suitable for humanities or for courses like biology, and it is the boys which are kind of doing excelling in the say in IT and engineering firms. So, this gender segregation is kind of constructed during our everyday interaction and then gets institutionalized through educational academy, where we kind of have this mindset that or the stereotype that girls are not good in maths or girls are not good in natural physical sciences, and this is reflected if we kind of look into the percentage of the women or girl student in say an engineering institution compared to a humanities. We see the difference in numbers, and then again the cultural idea of kind of differentiating the role that for men or for boys that education is compulsory, that education is required necessarily for him to become get a career, to get a progressive career, so that he becomes a better breadwinner. Whereas education for women, even in this say from our Indian society, is still not a primary or the most urgent necessity, because it is kind of restricted to becoming educated, to get educated as long as you can become an educated wife or an educated mother to tutor the children, and as long as you kind of depend on education to fulfilling that role, the significance of education goes out. And therefore, you know, there are a lot of data which kind of creates puzzle, that if in India we have seen that over the few years, if we kind of look into the newspapers and we see the as the 10th board or the 12th board is results are declared, there is a large number of higher percentage of women girl students performing better. So, most of the toppers of any board, centralized board examination, the toppers or the student with the highest marks are generally the girls. But then kind of a statistics changes if we kind of look into the results of the IIT, where the percentage of women kind of gets all the ratio of the girl student versus the boys gets kind of reduced. So, where is this transition happening, or how is this transition happening? despite the fact that the literacy level of girls have increased. If we look into any kind of data besides education, if we look into the work participation ratio, and if you look into any of the ILO reports, we see that the women starts withdrawing from the market, and the women's labor force participation has declined. So, and if we kind of go into the idea that there are a lot of gender framework which still functions in the transition from the domestic sphere to the public sphere. So, how do we kind of look into these ideas? And for that matter, it is important to understand the significance of the author, who presents a powerful and a convincing account of how gender inequality works and is reproduced in everyday interaction. Her argument that gender lurks in the background, always available as a way of understanding others or anticipating their behavior, many women experience gender in the workplace. So, the lag between the material change and cultural change in gender status belief also helps make sense of a chaotic and contradictory cultural landscape in which each significant step forward seems to be met with an equally dramatic leap. So structural factors such as the growth of the service, education, health, industrial economy do contribute to sex segregation of jobs and fields of study. So, if over the time the changes are made, conservative gender belief harder and harder to sustain as meaningful representation of men and women in everyday life. If over time change in the material arrangement between men and women continue to accumulate, the traditional content of cultural belief of a gender will gradually change as well. So, with this we have a good understanding of the gender framework and social inequality. For reference, read Cecilia L. Ridgway, Framed Before We Know It, How Gender Shapes Social Relation, published in the journal Gender and Society in 2009. So, with this I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.